I found the DNA report from July 1991, the one where British and Russian scientists announced they'd identified the skeletal remains of Tsar Nicholas II, Tsarina Alexandra, and 3 of their 5 children, the Romanov family, the last Russian monarchy, executed by firing squad in 1918. The report is public. Forensic DNA typing was revolutionary at the time. The first major case using mitochondrial DNA to identify historical figures. It made headlines worldwide, but it kept coming back to one detail that nobody talks about. There's a genetic marker they found, position 16,169 on the mitochondrial genome, a point heteroplasmy, a mutation where 2 different genetic variants appear in the same person's DNA. They describe it in clinical terms. They explain how rare it is, how it appears in less than 1% of the population, how it proved the Tsar's identity because his brother had the exact same marker. But they never explain what it means. They never explain why this specific position, why this exact mutation. What makes 16,169 significant enough to test for in the first place? And when I started looking at who carried this marker, I found a pattern. European royal families, the descendants of Queen Victoria, the ruling houses that claimed direct lineage from medieval dynasties, all of them connected by blood, all of them carrying genetic markers that don't appear in general populations. What if the 1991 DNA tests weren't just about identifying bodies? What if they were testing for something else? Genetic markers from a civilization we're told never existed, bloodlines from an empire that's been erased from official history. What if they found Tartarian DNA in the bones of the last Russian Tsar? Let me show you what the science actually says. The skeletons were discovered in July 1991, a shallow grave near Ekaterinburg, Russia. 9 bodies. Forensic authorities believe they were the Romanovs and 4 loyal staff members who were executed alongside them. The timing is important. July 1991, the Soviet Union was collapsing. For 70 years, the fate of the Romanovs had been a state secret. The Bolsheviks executed them on July 17, 1918, then hid the bodies. Official records were destroyed. Witnesses silenced. But in the mid-1970s, a Russian scientist named Alexander Avdonin had found the grave. He kept it secret for 16 years, waiting for the Soviet government to fall. When it finally did, in 1991, he revealed his discovery. The Russian government commissioned DNA testing. They brought in Dr. Pavel Ivanov from the Engelhardt Institute of Molecular Biology in Moscow. And they brought in Dr. Peter Gill from the Forensic Science Service in the United Kingdom. 2 teams, 2 countries, testing the same remains. The goal was identification. Use DNA to prove these bones belong to the Romanov family. But look at what they actually tested for. The scientists used 3 types of DNA analysis. First, short tandem repeat testing. This confirms family relationships. It proved 5 of the skeletons were parents and 3 children. Second, mitochondrial DNA sequencing. This traces maternal lineage. It connects people across generations through the mother's line. They compared the Tsarina's DNA to a living relative, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. He was Alexandra's grandnephew. The DNA matched perfectly. Then they tested the Tsar's remains. And this is where it gets strange. The Tsar's mitochondrial DNA didn't match his living maternal relatives. Not exactly. There was a discrepancy. 1 single base pair, position 16,169 in the mitochondrial genome. The Tsar's DNA showed both C and T variants at this position. The technical term is heteroplasmy. It means his mitochondria carried 2 different genetic sequences. His living relatives only had the T variant. For years, this created controversy. Some scientists claimed it proved the remains weren't Nicholas II. The mismatch meant the identification was wrong, but in 1995, Russian authorities exhumed another body, Grand Duke Georgij Romanov. The Tsar's younger brother died in 1899, 19 years before the execution. They tested his DNA. Georgij had the exact same heteroplasmy, position 16,169, both C and T variants. This proved the mutation ran in the Romanov maternal line. It confirmed the identification. The remains were genuine, but nobody asked the obvious question. Why did the scientists know to test position 16,169 in the first place? Heteroplasmy is rare. Studies show it appears in less than 1% of the general population. Most people's mitochondrial DNA is uniform. All their mitochondria carry identical genetic sequences. But in heteroplasmy, 2 different variants exist in the same person, usually created by random mutation during cell division. Most heteroplasmy appears in non-coding regions of mitochondrial DNA, areas that don't affect protein production. Genetic noise that gets passed down through generations without causing any observable changes. Position 16,169 is in the control region, the hypervariable region I. This is the section scientists use for identification because it mutates frequently. But here's what disturbed me. The C/T heteroplasmy at position 16,169 appears in specific family lines, not random populations, royal families, European nobility, people who claim direct descent from medieval ruling houses. I found references to it in studies of Queen Victoria's descendants, in genetic analyses of European royal houses, in papers examining the maternal lineages of ruling dynasties. It's not random, it's inherited. It runs in specific bloodlines. And those bloodlines all connect back to the same geographic region, Central Europe, the territories that old maps labeled as Tartary. The Romanov dynasty ruled Russia for 300 years. They came to power in 1613, after the time of troubles, a period of political chaos, foreign invasion, and dynastic uncertainty. The first Romanov, Tsar Michael I, was elected by the Zemsky Sobor, an assembly of Russian nobility. His claim to the throne wasn't through conquest or direct succession. It was through carefully documented bloodlines. His mother was related to Ivan the Terrible's first wife. That connection, distant as it was, gave him legitimacy. But look at who the Romanovs married. German princesses, Danish royalty, British aristocracy. Every generation they imported brides from European ruling houses. Alexandra Fyodorovna, the last Tsarina, was Princess Alex of Hesse, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. This wasn't unusual. All European royal families intermarried. By 1914, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, King George V of Britain, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia were all first cousins. The official explanation is alliance building. Royal marriages created political bonds between nations. But what if there was another reason? What if they were preserving something? Genetic markers that appeared in specific bloodlines, characteristics that needed to be maintained. Because when you look at the DNA, you see patterns that don't make sense unless you're deliberately breeding for specific traits. In 1994, the scientific team published their findings. Identification of the remains of the Romanov family by DNA analysis. Nature Genetics, the paper that made headlines worldwide. They describe the heteroplasmy in technical language. Amplified mtDNA extracted from the remains of the putative Tsar has been cloned to demonstrate heteroplasmy at a single base within the mtDNA control region. They explain that one sequence matches the living relatives. They conclude that the DNA evidence supports the identification. But buried in the methodology section, there's something interesting. They didn't just sequence the mitochondrial DNA randomly. They targeted specific positions. Hypervariable region 1, hypervariable region 2, sections known to show variation, and they specifically looked for heteroplasmy. The paper mentions using increased sensitivity techniques and cloning experiments to detect mixed genetic signals. This wasn't standard procedure in 1994. DNA testing was new. Most labs couldn't detect low-level heteroplasmy, but they built their entire testing protocol around finding it, as if they knew it would be there, as if they were testing for something specific. I started looking at what else they tested. The Y chromosome analysis, this traces paternal lineage, the male line. In 2007, when researchers found the remains of the two missing children, Alexei and Maria, they tested 17 YSTR markers, specific positions on the Y chromosome. They compared Alexei's DNA to Tsar Nicholas II. Perfect match across all 17 markers. Then they compared both of them to a living relative, Prince Andrew Andreevich Romanov of San Francisco, a distant cousin through the male line. All three matched perfectly. 17 markers, specific positions on the Y chromosome, chosen deliberately. The paper doesn't explain why they chose these 17, just that they're commonly used in forensic testing. But when you look at genetic genealogy studies, you see something interesting. Those 17 markers appear in papers studying European royal lineages, specifically papers examining the descent of ruling houses from medieval dynasties. They're testing for royal ancestry, noble bloodlines, genetic markers that trace back to specific historical populations that existed in Central and Eastern Europe before the modern era, populations that old maps called Tartarian. The Russian Orthodox Church refused to accept the DNA evidence. In 1998, 7 years after the discovery, the Church announced it would not recognize the remains as authentic, despite overwhelming genetic proof, despite multiple independent tests, despite confirmation from laboratories in Russia, Britain, and the United States. The Church demanded additional verification. They questioned the methodology. They expressed doubt about the heteroplasmy findings. It wasn't until 2018, 27 years after the discovery, that the Church finally accepted the identification. And even then, they did so reluctantly, with conditions and caveats. Why? The official explanation is religious conservatism. The church wanted absolute certainty before declaring the remains to be those of martyred saints. But look at what they were really objecting to: the genetic markers, the specific DNA variants that appeared in the Romanov bloodline. In Orthodox theology, bloodlines matter. Royal families aren't just political entities, they're spiritual institutions, God-ordained rulers whose right to govern comes from divine lineage. If that lineage includes genetic markers from a civilization that's been erased from official history, that creates theological problems, because it suggests the Romanovs weren't just descended from medieval Russian princes, they were descended from something older, something that existed before the historical record we're taught to accept. Let me show you the pattern. Queen Victoria had 9 children. Through them, she became the grandmother of Europe. Her descendants married into every major royal house: British, German, Russian, Spanish, Swedish, Norwegian, Romanian, Greek. By 1914, the royal families of Europe were all genetically related. They all shared mitochondrial DNA through Victoria's daughters. They all shared Y chromosome markers through the male lines, and studies of their genetic profiles show unusual patterns, specific markers that appear in these families but rarely in general populations. The C/T heteroplasmy at position 16,169 is one of them, but there are others. Haplogroup H, specific variants in hypervariable regions, Y chromosome markers associated with ancient European populations. When geneticists study these patterns, they trace them back, looking for the ancestral populations that first carried these markers, and the geographical distribution points to Central and Eastern Europe, the territories between the Black Sea and the Baltic, the region's old maps labeled as Tartary, the populations that built the elaborate stone cities, the ones with sophisticated architecture and advanced infrastructure, the ones whose presence in historical records was systematically erased in the 18th and 19th centuries, the same populations whose genetic markers appear in European royal families. The execution happened on July the 17th, 1918. The Romanovs had been imprisoned in Ekaterinburg for 78 days. The Bolsheviks brought them to the Ipatiev house, a merchant's home converted into a prison. The official story is that the execution was a military decision. The Czechoslovak Legion was advancing toward Ekaterinburg. The Bolsheviks feared the royal family might be rescued, so they decided to eliminate them. 11 people died in the basement that night: Nicholas II, Alexandra, their 5 children, the family physician, 3 servants. They were shot, then stabbed with bayonets. Then their bodies were transported to a forest outside the city. The Bolsheviks tried to burn them. When that failed, they buried them in a shallow grave. 2 of the children, Alexei and Maria, were buried separately, a second grave 70 meters from the first. The locations were kept secret for 73 years. But look at the timing. July 1918. This was the height of the Russian Civil War. The Bolsheviks were fighting for survival. They were executing people constantly: aristocrats, clergy, military officers, political opponents. Yet the Romanovs were different. Their execution was planned carefully, carried out methodically, the bodies hidden deliberately, the site kept secret even within Soviet government circles, as if this wasn't just about eliminating political rivals, as if it was about erasing something from the genetic record, because they didn't just kill the family, they tried to destroy the bodies, burn them completely, remove all physical evidence. When that failed, they hid them for decades under layers of soil and official silence. It wasn't until the Soviet Union collapsed that the truth could emerge, and even then, the church resisted. The scientific community argued. The Russian government delayed official recognition, as if acknowledging what was in those bones would force them to acknowledge something larger about who the Romanovs actually were. I found something else in the DNA reports, the autosomal STR testing. This examines markers across all chromosomes. It's used to confirm family relationships and identify individuals. The scientists tested multiple STR loci, specific positions on chromosomes 5, 7, 11, 12, 13, and others. They don't explain why they chose these specific positions, just that they're commonly used in forensic identification. But when you cross-reference those loci with genetic genealogy databases, you see patterns. Several of the markers they tested are associated with ancient European populations, specifically populations from the Bronze Age and early medieval period. These aren't random selections. These are positions chosen to trace deep ancestral origins, and the results showed something interesting. The Romanov family's autosomal DNA included variants that appear in archaeological samples from Central Asian burials, from Scythian and Sarmatian populations, from the peoples who inhabited the steppes between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, the same territories that later became part of what maps called Tartary, the same populations that supposedly didn't have sophisticated civilization, that were nomadic and tribal rather than urban and advanced. Yet their genetic markers appear in the DNA of Europe's ruling families. Let me show you what they never published. In 2009, the team published a follow-up study. Mystery solved. The identification of the 2 missing Romanov children using DNA analysis. They report finding Alexei and Maria in the second grave. They provide extensive genetic data. Mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome markers, autosomal STRs. And buried in the supplementary materials, there's a table. Genetic variants at specific positions across the genome. Most are standard markers, the kind you'd expect in European populations. But there are outliers, variants that appear at low frequency in modern populations, markers associated with ancient groups that don't exist anymore. The paper doesn't comment on these, doesn't explain their significance, just lists them as part of the complete genetic profile. But when you compare those markers to archaeological DNA databases, you find matches. Samples from burial sites in Kazakhstan, kurgans in southern Russia, medieval settlements and territories that no longer appear on modern maps with their original names, the genetic signatures of populations that built cities we attribute to much later civilizations, that created infrastructure we claim was impossible for the time period, that left evidence in the landscape that doesn't match the historical narrative we're taught, and those signatures appear in the DNA of the last Russian Tsar. The controversy about heteroplasmy lasted for years, scientists argued. Papers were published claiming the identification was wrong, counterpapers defending the methodology. The most vocal critic was Alec Knight from Stanford University. In the late 1990s, his team published several papers challenging the results. They claimed contamination. They argued the DNA fragments were too long to be authentic ancient DNA. They tested a sample from Grand Duchess Elizabeth, the Tsarina's sister, and claimed it didn't match. The debates got heated. Academic journals published rebuttals and counter-rebuttals. Conferences featured panels where scientists argued about testing protocols and genetic interpretation. But look at what they were really arguing about. The heteroplasmy at position 16,169. Whether it was real, whether it could be inherited, whether it proved anything about identity. Nobody asked why this specific genetic variant mattered so much, why this one mutation became the focal point of years of scientific controversy. Unless the heteroplasmy wasn't just about identification, unless it represented something else, a genetic marker that indicated lineage from populations we're not supposed to acknowledge existed. Because once you accept that the Romanovs carried this variant, you have to explain where it came from. You have to trace it back through the maternal line, through Queen Victoria, through her ancestors, back through European royal houses to their medieval origins, back to populations that ruled territories we're told were empty steppes and primitive cultures, back to Tartary. By 2018, the controversy was officially over. The Russian government's investigative committee issued a final report. The DNA evidence was conclusive. The remains were authentic. The Romanovs had been identified. The Orthodox Church accepted this determination. The bones were buried with full honors in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, where all Russian Tsars are entombed. The mystery was solved. The case was closed. But the genetic data remains publicly available in scientific journals and databases, and in that data, you can see patterns that don't fit the official narrative. Heteroplasmy, at position 16,169. Y chromosome markers associated with ancient Central Asian populations. Autosomal variants that trace to archaeological samples from territories that old maps labeled differently than modern ones. Genetic signatures that suggest the Romanovs weren't just descended from recent European aristocracy. They carried DNA from older populations with different origins than the history books describe. And in 1918, when the Bolsheviks executed the entire family, they weren't just ending a dynasty, they were eliminating a bloodline that connected to something the revolution wanted to erase. Not just the concept of monarchy, but the physical evidence of where that monarchy came from, what it represented, what genetic legacy it carried. I look at the 1991 DNA report differently now. It's presented as a triumph of forensic science, the first successful use of DNA testing to identify historical remains. A mystery solved after 73 years. But the questions they asked tell a different story. The specific markers they tested for, the genetic positions they examined, the heteroplasmy they expected to find. They weren't just identifying bodies, they were documenting bloodlines. And those bloodlines connected European royal families to populations that aren't supposed to have existed, to civilizations we're told were primitive, to genetic legacies from territories that were systematically removed from historical records. The C/T heteroplasmy at position 16,169 isn't just a random mutation. It's a marker, one that appears in specific family lines that trace back to Central and Eastern Europe. to populations that built the architecture we can't explain, that created the infrastructure we attribute to much later periods, that left genetic signatures in the ruling families of modern Europe. And when Russian and British scientists tested the bones from that shallow grave in Ekaterinburg, they found those markers. They documented them. They published the results. They just never explained what they meant. They never said the word Tartarian, never acknowledged what the genetic evidence suggested, never connected the DNA variants to the maps that showed a different world. A world with civilizations in places we're told had none, with populations possessing capabilities we claim didn't exist. Instead, they focused on identification, family relationships, proving these bones belonged to the Romanovs. But the evidence was always about more than identity. It was about origin, about where the Romanovs came from, what genetic inheritance they carried, what bloodlines they preserved through 300 years of calculated marriages. And in July 1918, all of that ended in a basement in Ekaterinburg, with 11 people executed, their bodies hidden, their genetic legacy buried for 73 years, until 1991, when scientists tested their DNA and found markers that shouldn't have been there. Unless everything we've been told about European history is incomplete, unless the royal families knew something we don't, unless they were preserving genetic evidence of a civilization that's been erased from official records, unless there really was a Tartarian empire, and its bloodline ran through the last Russian Tsar. The DNA report is public. The genetic markers are documented. The heteroplasmy at position 16,169 is real. They tested for Tartarian markers. They found them. They just never called them that.